إلى الله، نهيت قلبي عما سوى الله. أستغفر الله تبت إلى الله، نهيت قلبي عما سوى الله. أستغفر الله تبت إلى الله، نهيت قلبي عما سوى الله. أستغفر الله تبت إلى الله، نهيت قلبي عما سوى الله. أستغفر الله تبت إلى الله، نهيت قلبي عما سوى الله.
أستغفر الله العظيم الذي لا إله إلا هو،
الحي القيوم، وأتوب إليه، ونسأله التوبة والمغفرة والهداية لنا والتوفيق، إنه هو التواب الرحيم، إنه هو التواب الرحيم، إنه هو التواب الرحيم.
فاعف عنا يا فتاح يا عزيز يا الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي، يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما.
اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي، وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي، وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي، وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم
تسليما كثيرا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فاعلم أنه لا إله إلا الله،
لا إله إلا الله، لا إله إلا الله، لا إله إلا الله، لا إله إلا الله، لا إله إلا الله، لا إله إلا الله، لا إله رحمن يا رحيم لا إله إلا أنت يا 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 رحمن يا رحيم لا إله.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Muhammad Abdul Alim. On behalf of the World Council of Muslims for Interfaith Relations, Stand with Dignity and IslamiCity, I welcome all of you to this first episode of Muharram, a time of sacrifice and personal reformation. This will be a 10-part series where we will be covering various topics which I will go over with all of you. We are all involved in various interfaith activities, but we feel that there is not enough emphasis on intra-faith activities. And really, we cannot do justice to interfaith unless we have a very sincere effort in making sure that we have intra-faith also, and making sure we are working together on issues that matter to all of us. We hope that this series will be a template for intra-faith work on issues we face as one humanity. We are honored to have with us two esteemed hosts who have dedicated their lives to promoting a better understanding of Islam. They will be hosting these 10 sessions that we'll be going through. With Walji, he comes from the Shia tradition. He is an educator, humanitarian, filmmaker, author who has spent over 20 books on nutrition and natural medicine. And along with him, we have Dr. Aslam Abdullah, who comes from the Sunni tradition. He has a doctorate in communications from the University of London in England, and he is a resident scholar here at IslamiCity. I will hand this over to them, and they will be conducting this series from here on. And we hope to be learning from both of our scholars here and the guests that will be coming. So with that, welcome to all of you. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Hasnan Walji and Dr. Aslam Abdullah.
Thank you very much, Brother Abdul Ali. Thank you, IslamiCity. Thank you, WCMIR. And thank you, Stand with Dignity, for coming together to host this important event that would last for the next 10 days. Muharram is a month of great significance, not only for Muslims, but for the entire humanity and the world, if we look at it from that perspective. Because it is a month when one of us wrote a new chapter in the history of humanity. And this chapter was not written with the ink, it was written with the blood. It was a chapter that changed the paradigm of the human relationship. And it was a chapter that added a new dimension to the word sacrifice and the concept of sacrifice that has always been there in our world. And certainly, Dr. Walji will talk more about that chapter. But needless to say that the sacrifice has been an essential component of human sociology and psychology. If you reflect deeply, you would find that each of one of us is the product of sacrifice. We would not have been in this world without the sacrifice of our parents, specifically our mother, to whom we owe our existence. It is she who gave the utmost sacrifice in terms of carrying us in her womb and then making sure that we survive, making sure that we nurture, making sure that we grow up, and making sure that we learn the basics of humanity from her. At her own life, at the risk of her own personality, at the risk of her own identity. But when we look at the sacrifice, we see that almost in every aspect of life, whether it is a family or it is community, it is society, it is the country, it is the ethnicity, the concept of sacrifice is always at play. Even in our own personal life, we sacrifice in order to attain a better personality, in order to attain a better identity. But when we look at the definition of sacrifice, we see a very interesting definition coming from those who have tried to elaborate this one. They usually associate sacrifice with offerings to God, whether it is the offering of humans or offering of possessions. And you would be surprised to know that for the last 5,000 years, humans have been sacrificing fellow humans in order to please God or in order to earn better status in the eyes of God. There were at least 25 cultures in the world. Mayong in China, and the Maya in the Native America, and then in Tibet, in India, and in Mesopotamia, and other places. Even in the biblical writings, you would find the reference to human sacrifice that were offered to God. Yes, it was declared unconstitutional and unlawful only in the last century. Even then, the human sacrifice practice did not stop, because we see that as recent as 2020, there were at least 5 recorded human sacrifices in different parts of the world. As late as 1987, we find that in India, the women were forced to throw themselves on the pyres of their husbands as part of the sacrifice that their traditions asked them to do. But now it is considered murder. So that concept of sacrifice has been there. And people have been offering their sacrifices for the causes they believe in. Most of these causes are related to their own ethnicity, their own culture, their own nationality, their own what you call identities. It doesn't matter whether those who were sacrificing were Muslims or non-Muslims, or those who basically were the one who caused these sacrifices were Muslims or non-Muslims. The fact is that every group believed in offering one's own life or one's own positions for the sake of one's identity and one's ethnicity. And it is in this particular context we see that the new chapter that was written in this month of Muharram, some 1400 years ago, was a new idea, a new concept. A concept that revolves around the fundamental ideas that the life is important and sacred. But there come a moment in one's life when one's life is not or does not get precedence over one's own goals and one's own principles. In other words, life is important, but the goal of life become more important than one's life in certain moment of history. And that is what we are talking about, the new chapter that was written in Muharram. Dr. Waldi talked about it. So we look at that perspective not only from the perspective of Islam or from the perspective of Muslims or from the perspective of the Shias or the Sunnis, but we look at it from the perspective of a new dimension in human epistemology, a human endeavor to stand for certain principles that are everlasting and that would be everlasting, and that would not only benefit one group and one set of people, one ethnicity, one community, but the entire humanity as a whole. It is a different thing that we basically have confined it to a particular sect or a particular religious group or a particular community, but the reality is that that sacrifice encompasses the humanity and constantly gives inspiration to the people that yes, the life is sacred and important, but there comes a moment in the life of one when the principles and the goals of life become more important. It is in that particular context that we start this month of Muharram. We realize that this is also the month which the Muslims begin their calendar, Hijrah. And Hijrah is also a kind of sacrifice. Hijrah also is a movement for reformation. Hijrah is also a movement for sacrifice. But the sacrifice that was offered by none other than the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ is perhaps the most unique and most remarkable event in human history. And sooner or later, the world would realize the importance of that as we are becoming a global community, as we are beginning to basically challenge the old definitions of the word sacrifice and then include in that definition a new idiom that the a conscious decision can be taken by individuals to stand for principles regardless of the consequences and regardless of the outcome of that struggle. So we hope that the series that we have would highlight the essence of that sacrifice, because we believe that the sacrifice is the essence of life. But we have to be very clear as to what we mean by sacrifice and how we proceed on the footprints of those who have basically embarked on that path. With that, I hand over the mic to Dr. Walji to carry the discussion at a further level, and then we will, inshallah, have a discussion around these ideas that we are discussing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aslam, and thank you, IslamiCity and Stand with Dignity and the World Council for making this opportunity for us to come together and discuss this very important subject. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا أبو القاسم محمد. As we were getting ready to begin this session, somebody forwards me this message from the White House, and I thought it's worth sharing as we begin this. This is a message of President Biden. He says, Jill and I extend our warm wishes to all those observing the Islamic New Year and remembering the historical sacrifices during the holy month of Muharram. We join you in honoring the universal values of justice, equality, and compassion. The reason I thought I would share this with you is not only that it's remarkable and perhaps first time in the history of the United States that a message of this nature has come from the White House, and we welcome it. At the same time, I think it shows the understanding, the empathy, and the sensitivity of the leadership of this country, because President Biden used the word observe and not celebrate the new year. And I think that speaks volume for the significance of the event that we have gathered together to commemorate and to remember. So with that said, thank you, Dr. Aslam, for really delving into the subject, which has made my task much easier. And if I were to sum up the entire ethos and the essence of sacrifice, it would be summed up with this blessed verse of the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ, that never shall you achieve righteousness unless you give something out of that which you love. And Muharram, as it begins in the 10th of Muharram, is, as Dr. Aslam mentioned, is indeed a paradigm shift in the understanding of the very word sacrifice. And hence, when we were discussing this series, we said, let us set the groundwork and the basic understanding of the very word sacrifice. What does this word mean? You know, it's a heavy word, it's a lofty word, it's an easy word to pronounce, it's a very difficult word to implement. In the wider sense, to add to what Dr. Aslam has said rightly, sacrifice means giving up things which are valued or desired. Now, those things may be tangible, countable, like time, wealth, or it could be life, or intangible and immeasurable, like one's feelings, one's attitudes, one's opinions, one's aspirations, and even the ultimate, one's ego, the I that needs to be sacrificed in order to achieve a loftier goal. All these are given up for the sake of something that is more worthy or more important, as rightly hinted by Dr. Aslam. So that reminds me of a quote from Jim Elliot, a missionary, and he said, and I quote, that he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. I'll repeat, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Worth pondering about, because this is the mentality and the psyche of somebody who is willing to sacrifice, because they realize the importance. It is also important to bear in mind that though, as again Dr. Aslam mentioned, that the very word sacrifice conjures up or has a connotation which is limited to the slaughter of animals as offerings to God and hence surrender to God of some possession. But that obviously is an incomplete or perhaps a misunderstanding. It may be difficult to find within the Quranic vocabulary, and we have scholars of the Quran and Dr. Aslam who may be able to shed more light on this. But it's difficult to find the Quranic vocabulary in exactly having an equivalent word for sacrifice, which also has a wide literary usage. Perhaps nearest in the meaning in the Holy Quran is nusuk, when we say, Qul inna salata wa nusuki wa mahyaya wa mamati lillahi rabbil alameen, that say that my prayer, my nusuk, my sacrifice, or my giving, my living and dying all belong to Allah, the Lord of the all worlds. Surah Al-An'am, ayat number 162. So the deeper essence is that along with salat, giving suffices to support, encompass, and symbolize a life that is based on a premise that something that is given away includes everything that a person has, whether it be something tangible or intangible. And this value of sacrifice, like the it was mentioned in terms of the sacrifice of the parents and the mother, for example, that without sacrifice, life would be devoid of peace, harmony, cooperation. It would be full of conflict and discord, a prey to self-centeredness and the immediate gratification of desires. You know, in a society where you have more takers, there are more people who want to take something and less people who want to give, there is strife in that society. In a society where there are more people who are willing to give and less people who are willing to take, that's a society which is a peaceful society. Therefore, neither families nor communities can exist or achieve cohesiveness and strength without some sacrifice on the part of each other and the members of the society, and that no human endeavor can succeed in reaching its goal unless one sacrifices things valued or desired. And one of the most effective paths of sacrifice is when that path is taken personally to reach spiritual and moral heights. And I do not need to explain to this learned audience that we have in terms of the personal sacrifices of spiritual and moral heights that we need to attain, and the ibadat that we do, the good deeds that we do on a personal level are all part and parcel of that. But at the same time, to strive for justice and peace in a society is that we need also to make those sacrifices at a societal level. And it really becomes so very effective that when these two paths come together, the personal path and the societal path, then there is true peace and harmony. Allow me to elaborate. That firstly, on a personal basis, the sense of sacrifice strengthens our inner spiritual and moral resources, and they develop those qualities of character which are essential to our struggle at every level. Secondly, it develops and reinforces cohesion and discipline, giving it the strength and resources to make up for a better society at a wider universal level. And that truly is the underlying message of sacrifice, which is epitomized during the whole tragedy of Karbala as we know it. Every act of sacrifice nourishes and increases one's iman, for it transforms a verbal confession and a mental conviction into a living reality. As I would say that now is a time that you just don't talk the talk, but you actually walk the talk. The process is mutually interactive. The stronger the faith, the greater the capacity to sacrifice. The greater the sacrifice, the deeper the faith, and collectively, the greater the impact on a society. And therefore, the idea of sacrifice and change in society go hand in hand. Without that, it would be difficult. And the next subject that we are going to have, inshallah, tomorrow is actually going to be on reform and on change, and we'll elaborate. But in the final analysis, every sacrifice is a sacrifice of our love or value. When we give away money, life, familial tie, for the sake of Allah, for the sake of a bigger cause, what we in reality give up and make that sacrifice is our love for money, for life, or a relative, not the object itself. So, quickly to conclude, that some areas of daily sacrifices are time. It's our most precious commodity. And spending our time to seek the pleasure of Allah is one thing, but just to seek the pleasure of earning money and worldly possessions is truly to shortchange ourselves. And time is indeed the first thing that Allah demands of us. If we reflect more deeply, we know that the time is one thing we cannot hold onto even for a moment. A second passes, a second gone. Time will melt away, and what one earns will indeed stay forever and for eternity. And then the next one, that when we look at time, beyond time, is really the value of life. That a time may come when you'll be required to sacrifice, your life for the sake of Allah. To so lay down your life is the highest act of doing that sacrifice, as it is called, of doing that shahada, and one deserves to be called a shaheed, because life is one's most precious possession. You can only have the courage to die in the way of Allah as soon as you realize that life does not belong to you, but to Him, and you must render to Him what is His due. We must also remember that death, with that, you can never escape or avoid, that it will always come to you at the appointed hour and place and in the appointed manner. I will stop here, inshallah. We'll continue with the essence of that particular narrative of what happened in Karbala and how does it impact the level of sacrifice. So with that, I will hand this back to Dr. Aslam to continue.
Dr. Mazi, you rightly pointed out that the word sacrifice does not fully elaborate the Quranic perspective on that concept and that idea. It is primarily a Latin word,